My name is Blair Bovier. I work with the Political Reform Program of the New America Foundation. And on behalf of New America and our co-sponsor Common Cause, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel discussion, Instant Runoff Voting, what can you do for San Jose? This is a very timely event. Instant runoff voting has been on the agenda of the Elections Commission recently. And in April, the local Democratic Party Central Committee adopted a resolution urging the San Jose City Council to put a charter amendment before the voters, which would replace the city's current two-round runoff system of instant runoff voting. Before I introduce our moderator for today's event, I'd like to tell you a little bit about New America and our political reform program. New America is a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy institute that invests in new thinkers and new ideas to address the next generation of challenges facing our country. New America has a special focus on California, introducing cutting-edge solutions to our state's biggest challenges and enriching our civic discourse with a number of events, including this event here today. Our political reform program acts as a catalyst for innovative reforms that modernize our political institutions, many of which have not seen change since the horse and buggy days. We support universal voter registration, instant runoff voting, and proportional representation as ways to ensure that government looks and thinks like the people it is supposed to represent, a notion all the more important in a state as huge and diverse as this one. We've published a number of articles and scholarly papers, including some specifically about San Jose and instant runoff voting. They are available online, and the executive summary of our paper on instant runoff voting, the one with the red stripe, is available out in the registration table. We like instant runoff voting because it has the potential to save the city and taxpayers money, because it will boost voter turnout and get more people involved in the election of local officials. We also think it will improve the tenor of campaigns. We are proud to have Common Cause as a co-sponsor today with its long history of advocating for essential reforms such as reducing the overwhelming influence of private money in our public elections. Today's discussion about instant runoff voting features San Jose City Councilors Ash Kalra and Sam Ricardo, instant runoff voting expert Steve Chesson, and Ellen Wheeler from the League of Women Voters. We'll hear more about these folks in just a few minutes. We also have a rather impressive audience here today. We have folks who are current and former elected officials, probably some future elected officials. And we also have two representatives from Congressman Mike Honda's office, Danielle Young and Chris Malcolm. Thank you for joining us today. I think in planning for future events, it might be helpful if we had an idea of how many folks, how folks heard about the event today. So I'm curious, how many people received an email invitation directly from New America or Common Cause? How many people got one that was forwarded from someone else? Old-fashioned word of mouth? Okay. How many people are here just for free food? Okay. At this time, I'd like to tell you about our moderator for the panel discussion, Terry Christensen. Dr. Christensen, as many and perhaps most of you know, has a long history of accomplishments in San Jose and here at the university. He's a professor of political science, served as the department chair for a number of years, started the department's internship program, and at last count is the author and co-author of 9 books. Terry played a pivotal role in creating district elections in San Jose and establishing Communiversity San Jose, an innovative service-based partnership between the city, the university, and local neighborhoods. Please join me and welcome in Terry Christensen.
Good afternoon, thanks for being here. And welcome to San Jose State University. I think most of you have been here before. I see Councilman Pierluigi Olverio has joined us. He's one of our alumni. Yes. So we have a panel and we'll have questions following the panel discussion. There are cards available for you to write your questions and submit them. Blair or somebody else will be circulating to collect your cards. And then I'll be passing the questions along to the panel. You can ask them of the individual panelist or panelists as a group. I'm going to introduce each panelist just before they speak. They're going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. We're going to start with Steve Chesson, who will give us an overview and give us some of the details about how instant runoff voting works. Steve's the right guy to do it. He's a nationally recognized expert on instant runoff voting. and he's the president of Californians for Electoral Reform. He's a member of the executive board of the California Democratic Party, an active member of the League of Women Voters, and served for many years on the advisory board of the National Voting Rights Organization, Fair Vote. I can also tell you that the reason the county has the option of IRV voting in its charter is that Steve persuaded the Charter Revision Commission some years ago, of which I was a member, to put it on the ballot, and the voters approved that as an option for the county. So the county can move to that whenever Steve can push them into doing it. And he'll continue to try, I'm sure. Please welcome Steve Chesney.
Thank you very much, Terry. Now, I want to explain Instant Runoff Voting to you. The basic principle behind Instant Runoff Voting is very simple. You get a majority winner in a single election without the need for a second expensive runoff election. And some of the benefits of that are that the single determinative election would be held when turnout is highest, that is in November of even years. We typically get anywhere from, depending upon how exciting the June primary is, we get anywhere from 50% to double the turnout in November as we do in June. So what typically happens is when you have an open city council seat, you have half the electorate deciding who the two finalists should be, and then everybody else gets to decide which of those two people they like the best. With instant runoff voting, all the choices would be on the ballot in November, and all the voters would get to decide who the majority winner is in that. There's also financial savings to the city. We haven't been able to get figures from the city, from the staff yet as to how much city elections cost. When they're held normally in June and November, it's probably like somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. But when there's a special election, so the only thing on the ballot is a San Jose election. We've had many special elections. Fred Luigi was elected in a special election. Kenson Shu was elected in a special election. Those can cost, I'm sorry? Madison Lynn was in a special election just as the recall election. I think the recall election cost the city something like $500,000. So those can be very expensive. And with instant runoff voting using special elections, you clearly save a lot of money by only needing to have one election instead of two. There's also savings to the candidates. In Sam's election, when he ran in 2006, in the first election, he raised and spent about $95,000. And then in the November runoff, he raised and spent about over $100,000. Yeah, that's right. Asha's situation was kind of interesting. In his first election in June 2008, he raised and spent about $84,000. In the runoff, he was running against someone who not only withdrawn from the race, but actually had endorsed him. Even so, he still had to raise and spend $30,000 to do that. And there's also savings to the voters in time, in that they only have to think about the city council election once. They don't have to think about it twice. There's also less negative campaigning with instant runoff voting, as a winner has to appeal to an opponent's supporters in order to get their second choice rankings in order to win. And I'll be explaining that a little bit further as I go along. And I'm going to show you how it works. And for that, I'll need the overhead projector. Let me get that out. Basically, the ballot, instead of just letting you indicate your only choice, scroll it back a little bit so it uses the marks. Perfect, okay. The ballot, instead of letting you indicate just your first choice, you get to rank your candidates. You know, 1, 2, 3. Very simple. We're all used to ranking things. We're all used to top 10 lists. We're all used to going into, say, Baskin Robbins, and we know we want, you know, I don't know, blackberry fudge. But if they're out of blackberry fudge, we've got a second choice. So in Australia, where they've been using this since the 1920s, it's a very simple hand-counted paper ballot, and you just mark your choices, 1, 2, 3, as many as you want. But we don't like to do things by hand in the United States. We prefer to do things with machine counted ballots. This is what they use in San Francisco, and it's the same equipment that we have in Santa Clara County. So you indicate your first choice in the first column, your second choice in the second column, and your third choice in the third column. Okay, that does it for this part of it. So can I have the stage hands? Move that. So let's say we're having an election for dog catcher, and the candidates are Osh and Ellen and Sam. And in the first election, these are Sam's votes, and these are Ellen's votes. And these are Asha's votes. And Sam's got 2, 4, 6, 7 votes. And Ellen has got 4. And Ash has 2, 4, 6. Okay? Now, 6 plus 4 plus 7 is 17. A majority of 17 would be 9 votes. Because 8 wouldn't be enough. So to take 9 votes to get a majority. If this one were a plurality election, well, Sam's got the most votes, so he would clearly win. 4, 6, 7, that's right. Even though it's less than a majority. But we have 2-round runoff. In 2-round runoff, we'd eliminate Ellen. And then the race would be between Osh and Sam. And as we all know, it can get very dirty in those head-to-head one-on-one elections. But with instant runoff voting, what we would do is we look at, well, we say Ellen's gone. We've eliminated her. How do the votes tally? Well, everybody who voted for Sam, their ballot would stay with Sam. Everybody who voted for Osh is their first choice, their ballot would stay with Osh. And people who voted for Ellen, their ballots would move to their second choice. And so maybe Sam might pick up an additional vote. Osh might pick up 3 more votes because Ellen's supporters preferred Osh to Sam. And we end up with Osh winning, what's that, 9 to 8. So that's how instant runoff voting works. And I think that's about all I wanted to do for this part. If there's any questions that come up, I think there's cards people can fill out, and we can address questions on that.
Well, let me next introduce the loser in that. Sam Liccardo is my councilman. He represents the downtown district, Council District 3, the most complex and diverse and engaged of the districts. So maybe District 6, Pierre Luigi. Engaged, I mean. Sam previously served as a federal prosecutor and as a prosecutor with the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office. He served on boards of several affordable housing organizations, advocated for a successful countywide transit ballot measure in the year 2000, and Sam was instrumental in the city's adoption of inclusionary zoning. And Sam ran in 2006, and the runoff didn't really make any difference.
No, it didn't.
So there you go.
That's it.
He won the primary. He was ahead in the primary, and he won the runoff. So why did we waste our time?
Well, that's a good question, Terry. You know, that's the reason why I support IRB really has a lot to do with my experience in that election, because I was knocking on a lot of doors in that election. And when you knock on someone's door the first time, it's already intimidating and daunting. And eventually you get past the initial inhibition you might have, and you get to talking about how you need to fill a pothole hole down the street, and you need to do something about maintaining the park. When you knock on their door the second time, and the pothole's still there, and the park is still like it is, you really don't have much to talk about. And at that point, usually the respondents at the door just say, look, I've been voting, I voted for you last time, I won't vote for you again if you keep bothering me, just go away. And so it was really apparent to everyone the second time around, the idea of engaging the voters in a meaningful way kind of loses its value. And certainly the cost is still substantial, certainly to residents, to the city, and certainly to all those who are supporting candidates. And I think Steve really outlined very well how money plays a role in electoral politics in this city. We have, I think, very appropriate restrictions on how people can contribute to races. But if it's going to require someone $200,000 to win a council race, that's $200,000 we know that's coming from sources that many would want to have influence in some way in city policy. And we should be concerned about that. To the extent that we can reduce the amount to which candidates need to rely on money in order to get the message out, in order to run a competitive race, we will all be the better. So that is one clear reason for me to support this. The other really has to do with equity. I think that running 2 races for a single election puts a considerable burden on many candidates, particularly those with children and have jobs and need to continue working in order to support their families. That is simply not an option for a lot of candidates. And so in terms of ensuring that we can draw the best and the brightest from a broad spectrum across the community, we really need to make sure that we have an electoral process that is not onerous financially on people. I can tell you, I think here we can all tell you that there are long periods of time when you're running a campaign when you simply have to stop working because every minute is spent on doors. Well, that's just not a financial option for a lot of people. And so we need to shorten that window period where you're really out there doing the pushing. When I sat down with Blair and other folks who've been supporting IRV, as I saw it, there were 3 real cost barriers for the city that I was concerned about. One cost barrier was the cost I understood that the county might incur or might not incur in adopting software to actually change its process. I've been told since by Steve that may be a concern that is dealt with within the contract. But one thing is certain, that if the county incurs any cost, it will almost certainly be borne by the city. Because when I first heard about this, I started talking to some of my peers in other cities saying, hey, why don't you come in and join us and we'll split the cost, and all of them said, well, we don't really have June primaries, so we don't care. So it's really going to be on San Jose, and that's really what the impact is. Secondly, there's certainly a charter amendment that would be required. There is a 6-figure cost to that as well in any election cycle, which we may want to add this. This is something the council did consider about 1.5 years ago, but we were winnowing down the number of proposals we could consider because of cost considerations. And although there's undoubtedly a cost savings in the long run for the city, in the short term it's a hit. And so you need to do it in a year when you can sustain that. And then finally, I think a very significant cost, which I don't have any idea how to estimate, is about outreach. I've had some involvement in IRV races. I was stuffing for a friend of mine up in San Francisco, David Chu, who successfully ran for supervisor up there, and spent a lot of time knocking on doors, talking to people in shopping centers and so forth. And even in San Francisco, where IRV has been in place for some period of time, there was still a considerable amount of confusion. And so it's going to take time, and that means you need to spend the resources in outreach. That outreach in the city of San Jose needs to be in at least 3 languages, if not more. That's going to take some cost as well. So it seems to me that solving those challenges is critical. I strongly support IRV. I think it's the right approach for us. The question is, how can we get there? And I'm certainly open to your ideas.
Thank you, Sam. Our next speaker is Ellen Wheeler. Ellen is an active member of the League of Women Voters in Los Altos, Mountain View. She's chairperson of the Education Committee for the League of Women Voters of Santa Clara County. She's an attorney, also serves as an elected member of the school board of Mountain View Richmond School District, and most importantly, she's a San Jose State University alumna. Welcome, Ellen.
Okay, I'm going to ask your indulgence at the beginning of my presentation. Today is graduation day for our middle school, and I need to leave immediately after, so I'm going to do a little commercial first and say that at the table at the entryway, I put out a piece of paper. If anybody would like to join the league, please put your name and address. I'll make sure your information gets to the appropriate person. There are 5 leagues in Santa Clara County. We are the Santa Clara County's largest league in Northern California. If you are lucky enough to be a member of a resident of Mountain View, Los Altos, or Los Altos Hills, you can fill out one of these blue sheets. And I also gave you a little primer on League of Women Voters, so I'll just gloss over it now, and you can study it when you get home. And lastly, I gave you something called Facts for Voters. This is an outreach that League of Women Voters does. It gives you information about local candidates, state candidates, and national candidates. So that's it for the commercial. Yes?
I'm just going to put a plug in for the local league. If you want to contact the voters for San Jose and this and surrounding areas, you can get that at, they're in our libraries.
Oh, great,
So,
thank you. This is a
downstairs.
member of our San Jose League.
Continue.
I was asked today to tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters and how it is that the League endorsed instant runoff voting and why it is and why that's important. So the League of Women Voters is an organization that's almost 90 years old. We were formed from the women who work to get the vote. So it's this organization has been around since 1920 with the 19th Amendment. And we've been working on voting issues, democracy, and civic engagement ever since. And you can tell that today we're hitting all three of those things. What the League does and why it's useful for members of the public to pay attention to what the League does is we are well known as an organization that studies extensively issues around voting, some social policy issues like education, and we take testimony from experts, we do look at the record, and then after we've collected that information, we have what's called consensus meetings. And it's like old-fashioned town hall meetings where we send out a call, come to this consensus meeting. The people who come to that consensus meeting listen to the information, they discuss, they argue, they try to persuade, and at the end of the day, they are asked to say yes or no. Do you agree with this position? And it's consensus. It's not majority, minority. It's not a vote. It's the general sense of the attendees that day. So, and we have multiple positions, in the state, nationally, locally, that have been approved by the League in that manner. Instant runoff voting is one of those issues. And, I have to, again, extend a hand to Steve, because as a member of our local League of Women Voters in Mountain View, Los Altos, Steve has been the driving force, an expert force, a political force trying to get instant runoff voting. But at those consensus meetings, we could have voted against Steve. That's another strength of the League. One person isn't going to powerfully influence somebody else just by their status or certainly not their money. It's the power of your argument and get a lot of people to agree with you. So the League has studied the issue of instant runoff voting and agreed that it was the best way to do voting. Partly, I don't need to give you the reasons, Steve gave you the reasons, but I can tell you that the League of Women Voters in our local area re-endorsed instant runoff voting. We're waiting to hear from county again. The county League of Women Voters endorsed instant runoff voting for county supervisor elections, and we're encouraging the county supervisors to implement that. And the state League of Women Voters has endorsed instant runoff voting. So I'm here today to tell you that the League thinks this is a good idea.
Thank you, Ellen. Our fourth speaker is Ash Kalra. Ash is a council member and grew up in San Jose in the district that he now represents. Prior to his election to the city council, he worked as an attorney for the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office and served as a member and chair of the San Jose Planning Commission. Ash is also a professor at Lincoln Law School here in San Jose. He's an active member of a number of community organizations. You've already heard about his unique runoff, which will give him, I think, a special perspective on this topic. So, Ash, welcome.
Thank you. And I'm glad to see such a good turnout for this discussion. And as Professor Christensen mentioned, I did have a unique race. And Sam already went over some of the policy issues as well as options. I think I was invited mostly because of the case study. And so I'll get right to it, what happened in that race. So I was elected this last November in 2008. In the primary, which was in June, there were 6 people total on the ballot. Now, on the date, it was in February, the last possible date which was allowed, or maybe early March, the last date you could take your name off the ballot. One of my opponents announced that she was withdrawing from the race. However, she didn't remove her name from the ballot. And so as the election went on, there were still 6 of us that were on the ballot, even though just 5 of us were campaigning. So when it came down to the election, I ended up earning 43% of the vote. The other 5 candidates shared the rest. But the unique aspect of the race, which I don't believe had ever occurred in San Jose previously, was that Jackie Adams, who was the one that had withdrawn, she came in second, barely over 3rd place. It was literally about 10 votes separating them. She had close to 19, a little bit under 19% of the vote, I believe, is where she ended up. But she ended up in second, even though she hadn't campaigned. And keep in mind that she's been on the school board for a decade and a half, and she certainly had the most name recognition out of all of us that were running, but she wasn't campaigning. And so she came in second, but since I did not get 50% of the vote plus 1, there had to be a runoff. And the runoff was between myself and Jackie Adams. After the primary and then going into the runoff, she did then endorse me, and so I was able to let people know that, but I still have to go through the election. And Sam is absolutely right. When you knock on doors the 2nd, 3rd, 4th time, you don't have much to say. That's different. But in my case, I did have something to say before the runoff, which is my opponent's endorsement. but I didn't take Sam's absolutely right. For the primary, it took 3 months off work to knock on doors, and I didn't do that or have to do that for the general because it wasn't the same type of race. I only had to raise $30,000 as opposed to, or spend $30,000 as opposed to close to $90,000, which was spent in the general or the primary election. I think it's pretty clear that in my specific case, if instant runoff voting was there, I likely would have gotten 50% plus 1, because all that would have required is that you take the 19% of the 2nd place, and take my 43%, that's what, 62%. And so of the remaining 38%, 7% of those voters would have had to voted for me as 2nd place for me to reach that 50% threshold. So it's an interesting example, but it is there's no doubt an aberration that's never happened in the city of San Jose before. So I certainly don't want to use my case as an example of why for every case instant runoff voting should apply, but it does certainly speak to the fact that if instant runoff voting did exist, that there would not have been a general election. There certainly wouldn't have been the additional cost and the additional. The reality was that the voters, still a lot of them still weren't aware of the situation, so there still had to be outreach in regards to that. And Sam mentioned the costs of an election, of raising money, and it's not just getting money from folks that may have a special interest in terms of having the ear of a city council member, but it's also a lot of family and friends, relatives, neighbors that give money, and you have to go back to them as well, and that's an expense. And overall, I think that in Sam's case, with another $90,000 spent in the general election, I'm sure that that money could have been spent in other places in our economy, and or some of the family members, other folks I may have given to Sam and myself, could have had better uses for that money as well. So there's certainly in that regard relevance in terms of the overall cost. Now, when it comes to the principle itself, I certainly think that cost is and should be one of the factors, and as should efficiency. However, ultimately, we need to make sure we have the best democratic process, and the best democratic process that makes sure that everyone's vote is heard loudly and clearly. And so I think that's really going forward where the analysis from my perspective will be in terms of instant runoff voting is cost. Obviously, as a council member, I know how important it is to make sure that we give them the cost as much as possible, And we do have other examples now of other cities that are using it, and I think we're in a great position right now to examine what's happening in other cities, what impact it's had on the democratic process. If there's still, the outreach hasn't been completely done, has it had some impact on those folks that were voting before, but maybe now are a little confused and don't vote as much, so that will tell us how much outreach we would need to do if we were to put in this type of system, and clearly also the cost that's required for a charter change and so on. I am interested, and I've always been interested in making sure we can increase voter turnout and voter participation. One of the goals I think mentioned of the organization is the universal registration, making sure folks are registered to vote. I know that Assemblymember Joe Cotto, in fact, Darcy Green, when she was in that office, helped to write legislation and promote it, put forward legislation that every high school senior would have to register, either register or opt out of registering as a requirement of graduating from high school. Now that would include doing government class and exercising democracy and so on. But that's certainly one idea that I thought was a good one, to increase participation and registration. So ultimately, I think that should be a goal, whether it's through instant runoff voting or otherwise. We should continue to always look at opportunities to increase voter participation.
Thank you, Ash. Our panelists have been very disciplined. For questions, I have several good questions in my hand, so if you want to add to this little pile, please do so. But I'm going to start with my own question first. The blowback I get on IRV is that sometimes candidates need 2 rounds of elections to become better known, especially if they're not already well known and they're not already well funded. The other thing I observed is sometimes candidates are actually better by the time they get to the runoff because they really develop as spokespersons for themselves. So I know Ash and Sam have addressed this a little bit. I'd like to hear from other members of the panel what you think about the advantage of a longer frame campaign, and 2 chances rather than just one for a candidate to define himself or herself.
Well, I guess I'll take that. The argument is made that the voters benefit from having a second opportunity to look at the candidates. However, as we've seen, for most of the voters, they're taking their first look in November. So they're not really getting a second look at the candidates, they're just taking their first look. Secondly, in that second head-to-head election, we see a lot of negative campaigning. And we see it more in the second election than the first election for a reason I'll explain. When we had that 3-way race between Sam and Ellen and Osh, if Sam threw mud at Osh, that might discourage people from voting for Osh. But they had another choice. They could have voted for Ellen. So it wouldn't have necessarily held him. But in that head-to-head race, and then so you see that in the first election, people talk about their issues, what they stand for. They very rarely attack the other candidates when the field is large. But in that head-to-head race, if Sam throws mud at Osh, he may convince somebody not to vote for Osh. They may not like Sam. They may stay at home. And that helps Sam, because he's discouraged someone from voting for Osh. So we do see, excuse me, we do see in those head-to-head runoff elections, they can get very dirty. We see a lot of last-minute hit pieces where there isn't really enough opportunity for the candidate being attacked to respond to the hit pieces. And I don't think the voters really learned very much, other than the fact that, what some candidate did 20 years ago when they weren't married. So I hope that addresses the question.
Anybody else?
I'd offer this. My perspective from the San Francisco supervisorial races is they did get nasty anyway, but at San Francisco, that probably has a lot more to do with it. I think we have much more civil discourse in the city, and it's a good thing. The one thing I would say is this: when we look at the presidential context of the candidates you see in the primary and the candidates you see in the runoff, there's considerable variance often in the positions they take. And I find that immensely frustrating as a voter, because I know everybody's trying to play to their base in the primary, and so you get the Republicans going to the wacko right wing, and the Democrats, talking to only one segment of the Democratic Party, and that's very frustrating, because that's not going to be the position in the runoff, and that's not how they're going to govern, because nobody can govern that way. And so it seems to me having a single candidate running with a single set of positions is far preferable for voters.
You know, with IRV, with instant runoff voting, the dynamic of that first election changes because Sam knows in order to win, he's going to need to appeal to supporters of his opponents to rank him second in case he cannot accumulate enough first choice votes to win outright. And we see this in Australia, where candidates appeal to supporters of their opponents to rank them as second. We saw that actually the first time San Francisco used instant runoff voting, and I think it was District 5. They had like 22 candidates. And 3 of the candidates campaigned jointly, campaigned cooperatively. One was, I believe, Irish American, one was Latino, and one was Asian American. So they each had their own natural basis. And so when they went to their bases, they said, vote for me as your first choice, but list my friends as your second and third choices. And you've never seen that before. You don't see that in any other kind of election except in instant runoff voting, because the dynamic of the election is such that you benefit from campaigning cooperatively and appealing to your supporters. So there's a disincentive to throw mud. That's going to hurt you.
To that point, though, I think there is a counter to that, which is there's the opportunity for collusion if you get folks with different bases coming together and saying, well, vote for me, vote for him second, vote for third, and really that waters down the support of maybe one candidate who maybe, you know, if it was a two election system, the primary and general, and they had beaten all of them, and they do the instant runoff voting, maybe first round he beats all of them, but because there's a collaboration of other folks running, that can cause to dilute the true support for that one individual. So I mean, there's both sides to that, and I definitely agree with the idea that you're going to get less nastiness in an election because you just don't benefit from it in the same sense. But I think that the other flip side is there as well. And then one last comment in regards to Sam had talked about San Francisco's. We bring up San Francisco. Well, every area does have its own unique issues when it comes to elections. If you look at San Jose, we have some pretty restrictive rules when it comes to running city council. That you can't spend money, or you can't raise money from 6 months before, and so on, which really limits the amount of the window of time to really get yourself out there. No one knew who I was when I started running. There were very few people in the community, other than the neighbor associations I was involved with. But the majority of the electorate, you have to really spend a lot of time knocking on doors and getting to know them. So I think look at other rules that are in place to see if they need to be restricted or loosened, so that it gives more time for each of the folks running to really, so there's 5 people running, now they have, rather than being limited in that window, they have much, it just lengthens the, if it's just going to be one election, it lengthens the time of the election to get time for all the candidates to let themselves be known.
Okay. We have 2 questions to the point. IRV seems like a no-brainer. Who would oppose this and why? Maybe these aren't the right people to ask. But Ellen, in the league discussion, there must have been some people who argued against, even though you reached consensus.
I'm going to hand this question to Steve because he was very active in this.
Okay. Well, the arguments against IRV that came out of the league study, number one, was that voters need to learn how to use instant runoff voting. It's a different system, and with any new system, there's going to be a learning curve. Another argument against was that candidates were going to have to learn how IRV affects their campaigning. I will admit that these are weak arguments against, but these were the arguments that were made. Also that the county has to implement instant runoff voting. And as you mentioned in the first question, some people prefer two-round runoff because they like to see the field winnow to 2 candidates. In terms of who actually opposes actively instant runoff voting, our experience of Californians for Electoral Reform in trying to get instant runoff voting implemented is there are basically 3 categories of active opponents. And one, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, are the election officials themselves. They have a very hard job. I've worked as an election clerk, as a precinct inspector, as a field inspector for a number of years with the Registrar of Voters Office. And it's a very hard job. It's like you're rehearsing for a play all year that has one night, one performance, one night, and you try to get it as perfect as possible. And so for a lot of them moving to instant runoff voting, it's something new that they have to learn. So there's just a natural resistance to why you're trying to make my life harder. So that's number one. Number two are campaign consultants. Whose income depends upon having elections in which they can consult. And if you move to instant runoff voting, you basically you basically cut their income source in half. So we've seen opposition from that quarter. And then the third place that we've seen opposition, let's see, election systems are like perpetual motion machines. There's no such thing as a perfect system, but that doesn't stop people from trying to design them. So there's people out there who prefer some other kind of system. And they see that, well, if you're thinking about changing from instant runoff, from two-round runoff to instant runoff voting, maybe you should consider changing to this other system, this other system, this other system. Systems that have never been used anywhere in public elections are really instant runoff voting. And so we find opposition in that quarter.
Yes, in that third group that Steve referred to, I guess I would create a small subgroup of math PhDs. These are the folks that want to email me about this issue. And there are several math PhDs that are pushing approval voting in particular. Steve and I discussed it earlier today, which would be a method in which if you're presented with 9 candidates, you vote yes or no on each one of the candidates individually, and whoever gets the most yes votes at the end of the day wins. Certainly that's another approach. But again, I think that my knowledge has never been tried. I think there's undoubtedly other math PhDs will disagree.
Okay, this next one, I think this is a good one for Sam and Ash. Ellen and Steve can respond as well. You say you want to save money by getting rid of unnecessary and expensive elections by promoting IRV. Why don't you go further and extend council terms to 8 years? So the second term election, because the second term election is often unnecessary with low turnout, high approval, expensive, and the incumbent always gets reelected.
I would assume I want it for 8 years. But it gives you an out. But I think that that's at least something to explore. But I think 4 years. Part of it is we're used to 4-year terms, and it's a good number, and it allows an opportunity. For example, we saw this recall election that was extremely expensive this past year. And the reality is, if they just waited another year, they could have had an opportunity to voice their opinion at the ballot box. And so I think 4 years at least allows an opportunity for folks to really, and I think that's a good amount of time to get a gauge for your representative, and to feel like your representative is adequate in the representation. But I do understand the point that realistically speaking, it's very rare that an incumbent council member or even mayor gets unseated after 4 years. So it's something I think that we should certainly explore. But I never really given much thought until I heard it right now.
To me, it all depends on how long this pay cut takes effect. Yeah, I think I see it the same way Yash does. The reality is you don't know how anyone's going to be until they really get into office. And if they get into office, they're really off the deep end. I think everybody wants the ability to pull them back. It seems to me having that sense of accountability, year 2, year 3 into your term, you start realizing, oh wait, I do have to go back to those same voters, and I better start paying attention. So I think it's a good thing to have people check in with the voters every 4 years.
Yeah, I think so too. I think this one's probably for Steve. Can you put the same person for all choices? What if you only make one choice?
Oh, yeah. Putting the same person for all your choices is just like putting down a first choice and not putting down any other choices. As long as your candidate stays in the running, your ballot is going to stay with that choice, with that candidate. But if your candidate is eliminated, and you've indicated no other choice, you put your same candidate as your second choice, well, that candidate's been eliminated. So your ballot can't stay with that person. It's as if you didn't bother to show up for the runoff election because your first choice wasn't in the runoff and you didn't like anybody else, so you stayed home. So if you're allowed to do that, but you're disenfranchising yourself if you do that.
Okay. This one's from an election commissioner. If a 5 to 6 person election were decided utilizing instant runoff in November, wouldn't that eliminate substantive debates leading up to election as any debates would be nothing more than a series of sound bites versus extensive discussion of issues between two candidates, which would provide public a greater opportunity to assess the best candidate. So it's really about, I guess, the cacophony of multiple candidates versus two candidates debating for a more clear choice.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, Steve offered me the opportunity to let you know about another voting service that the League of Women Voters does, which is we do pros and cons forums where the League of Women Voters wears its neutral hat and it gives voters information, pro and con, about initiatives. The other is we have forums where we invite all the candidates, and we get good turnout at these. They're usually filmed locally, and my experience locally is that the candidates are given plenty of time to express their opinions. The audience members are given plenty of time to ask their questions. I've never been to a candidate forum where there were more questions than time. And I think also when you focus it like this, you get more attention.
I think, I don't know if that's, that certainly would be a concern. I think that sound bites, whether we like it or not, are probably the way most people get their information anyway, whether it's going to a forum or not. I think that in terms of attention span, in terms of now using new media, I think that, in fact, the new media may be an opportunity to get more substantive discussions through organizations like the League of Women Voters, to get video clips on or get substantive answers to questions posted on websites and so on. In my and Sam might have a better, because of his experience, to talk more about the general debates and so on. But in my case, we have candidate forums where there are anywhere from 4 or 5 of us there at a time. And I think that the forums were helpful in terms of people putting a face to the name, putting a face, and getting a chance to see and meet us, more so than substantive discussion. And I think that there's always a limit to how much substantive discussion, and we see it in the presidential, even when it's head to head, there's still a limit to how much substantive discussion is really had. And so I don't see that in particular as a huge barrier, but I do think that that's why earlier I mentioned we have to relax some of the rules to allow more time for the candidates to put themselves out there, and so allow for a longer campaign season that's just going to be one election. So allow more time for forums, as well as more time for any individual candidate to get out there and let the voters know who they are.
Our discussion assumes that main method of information that voters get in these types of forums, and what we know, especially with modern voters, is that they get their information from a variety of sources. And I can tell you, the League of Women Voters has a highly regarded resource called Smart Voter. So it's www.smartvoter.org. That's all one word. And we get a lot of hits on that site where people are finding out information, they're doing their own self-discovery of candidates, and there are other ways to do it too. So I think the question kind of involves a false premise.
Okay. In San Francisco, Ed Chu was elected as a supervisor using IRB. Soon it was found he didn't live in the district and was being investigated by the FBI. IRB did not allow enough time to truly vet the candidates. With the two-election system, wouldn't this have been avoided?
Yeah. I didn't follow that race closely. I know Steve Hill in the audience.
He represented my district. I followed it.
Would you like to respond to the question?
Sure. Sure.
I mean, I do know that he was the first choice of that primarily Asian district. Well, maybe Steve can speak better than this, but I think that.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Chu.
Can you speak into a microphone?
Sure.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Stephen Hill. I direct the political reform program for the New America Foundation, and I live in San Francisco. And Mr. Chu was my representative for a short period of time until he had other things to do. The fact is, Mr. Jew was, it was a really interesting race in which you had two candidates. One was backed by the mayor, the other was backed by the progressive forces who everyone thought was going to win that race. And they had all the money, and Mr. Jew went about knocking on doors, you know, really doing a grassroots campaign. And while the other two proceeded to attack the heck out of each other, savagely with, you know, with mailers and everything else, Mr. Jew became the second choice on pretty much everyone else's ballots, as well as being the first choice on his own supporters' ballots. So by doing that, he was both the plurality winner, so he had the most #1 rankings, as well as he was the instant runoff winner. The information that happened to him didn't come out during that part of the campaign. It didn't come out even until after the November election, that if they'd had a second round, excuse me, December, if they'd had a second round, it would have been in December. Didn't come out till after that either. So it's kind of hard to believe that that it would have come out by just holding a second election. I mean, he was, you know, it was, I don't think anyone in San Francisco really thinks that either. So it's kind of interesting that people down here would be talking about that. It's just the case that, you know, sometimes you elect bad people. Any electoral system can elect bad people. Duke Cunningham got elected through the plurality system. And, you know, it's just the fact of electoral systems. Sometimes you elect people that don't deserve to be there.
I would agree with that. We've had instances in San Jose, which doesn't have that system, where people have to step down because of parties or what have you. So there's always going to be aberrations or exceptions.
But they did live in the district.
Well, yeah, but whatever the reason is that they had to step down, they had to step down. And there were other issues besides just not living in the district that were an issue as well.
Yeah.
And so that was just one factor.
He did have long-standing roots in that district, and he was, as I said, he campaigned more door-to-door than any other candidate in that district. So no one had the idea that somehow he was not from that district until I started researching. And that was after he also got in trouble for trying to bribe people, and there was the federal investigation of the bribe that uncovered where he possibly lived. And that didn't come out until after he was already seated as a supervisor and started trying to shake down people at these tapioca shops. And he tried to say, look, this is how we do business. They needed something done for them, and this is how we do things in my community.
And I think my point is to that. If you look at Jew's case, look at my case, and say, well, what are the general? I mean, rather than looking at individual cases and say that's why we should have it, we should look at the greater policy and see why it doesn't make sense.
So was that Jew the rock of San Francisco?
We didn't have mental opposition research on him. If you're running against him, you would have taken a look at that candidate, or the newspapers might have taken a closer look at that candidate, where he lived.
No, but I'm saying that no one did that until after he was already in office and started trying to shake people
But if there
down.
was a second election, they would have done that.
No, because everyone assumed he had an address in the district. He had lived there.
Newspapers assumed.
He had lived there off and on, and he was the most.
Okay.
They would have dug him.
Okay.
He was the most present candidate in the district.
Sam has a comment on this one. Yeah.
I just say, the problem with informing voters is always going to be before us, no matter what the system is. In Asha's risk, you had somebody who was not a candidate officially, who was getting a significant minority of the vote because people just weren't informed. And so, no matter what the system is, IRB or otherwise, there is always going to be that challenge.
Okay, here's a little different angle on the question. A recent study commissioned by the Elections Commission showed candidates pumped over $9 million into our economy. What a shortened election cycle to save the city some money hurt our local economy, particularly the salaries of political consultants. Well,
I can touch that.
I guess the answer is yes.
Well, that money, I would say, would probably get spent in San Jose anyway, because that money was contributed, by people, by businesses, and they would have spent that money on other things in San Jose anyway. So the money would be mine.
Well, it's actually not all spent in San Jose because there are printers and consultants and media people and so on. Some of that money is exported from our town. So, but that could be an election reform too, actually. Like from local vendors. Okay, here's another question. Cost expense arguments are compelling. Tell us why the voters are better represented. In the example here, we ended up with a candidate who had fewer first choice votes. That's the example you gave, I think, Steve.
Yeah.
Why does this make sense?
Well, I use that as an example just to illustrate how instant runoff voting works. In actuality, just like in two-round runoff, the person who's the leader in first choices usually ends up winning in instant runoff voting. You occasionally get the upset, just like you occasionally get the upset in two-round runoffs, where the person who came in second ends up winning in the runoff. And the important thing is that your first choice leader does not necessarily have the support of the majority of the voters. For example, you could have a case where there's one candidate over here and two candidates over here. And 40% of the voters support this position. And 60% of the voters support the positions of these candidates, only they're split 30-30. Or 35-25. And with plurality, the 40% winner would win, even though majority of the community opposed them, majority of the district opposed them. With instant runoff voting, what would happen is you'd eliminate the candidate with a 25% support, and since they also like the candidate who got 35% support, that candidate would pick up the majority of the vote, and that candidate would win, and that's the majority choice of the community. And if you believe the majority rule, as opposed to plurality rule, then that's the result that you want.
Okay, this is the last question, but after this one, I'll give the panelists all an opportunity just to close if they like. And this question is, how realistic is it to think that this might happen anytime soon in San Jose?
We don't have the money to put anything on the ballot in 2009. So I think realistically, if we were to move this direction in November of 2010, would probably be the first we would be taking a crack at this. That's my gut, and that's of course assuming that somehow we decide as a council that other ballot initiatives, which we may want to put on the ballot in November of 2010, ballpark or otherwise, are not going to take priority or whatever. If we, without limited pool of money in the general fund, to be able to put items on the ballot, that's really going to probably drive this more than anything right now.
Oh, what's that? Okay. Steve, did you want to add?
Well, it's just a matter of building community support for it, and taking appropriate time. I agree, it's probably given the current budget situation, financial situation, trying to have this on a special election would not be a good idea. But I think a November 2010 charter amendment is very doable. Back in November '98, when Measure F was on the ballot, this was the charter amendment to allow the county, Santa Clara County, to use instant runoff voting. It was endorsed by the Mercury News, by the Labor Council, and by the Chamber of Commerce. So there's widespread community support for this kind of reform, and we need to just begin the process of getting back in touch with those organizations to let them know this opportunity so we can have the community support in getting instant runoff voting to San Jose.
I do think it would be ironic if we had a low voter turnout special election.
Maybe, but those are the voters who pay the most attention. We actually have one more question coming. San Francisco spends about $3 to $5 million for a citywide race and has seen significant cost savings using IRB. San Jose is San Jose is a much larger city. How much would San Jose save?
I think you answered that there would be ramp-up costs,
Yeah.
At first, and then they would decrease.
Yeah, I'd be guessing really, but for us, it's clear that it's going to be short-term costs and long-term gain. And how long we recover those costs is not clear yet. I think we need to get the city manager probably to get us a full report on that. And that's certainly something we should be doing in the meantime. So thank you for the question. Sorry, that's not a very good answer.
You're welcome. It wasn't my question. Well, let's give the panel a chance to just, for closing remarks, Ash, start with you.
I'm glad we've had this discussion today, and I think it allows an opportunity not just for audience members and interested community members and groups to consider it. But frankly, for me to have the opportunity to listen and learn more about it, and for Sam and Councilor Oliver is here as well, I think going forward, we definitely need to take care of consideration to make sure that what we receive, again, encourages most voter participation in a reasonable manner, but efficiency and cost are real concerns. And so if this is a model that's being used that we can do research on and analyze and determine that it's the best course of action for us, I think this is the time to do it. Let's take a good hard look at it and see if it's something that will work for the city of San Jose. And if so, proceed appropriately.
I'd just like to thank Steve and the others for including the League of Women Voters today. I helped some of you with your confusion about the League of Women Voters and encourage you, because you're all obviously interested in voting, to join or become active in the league.
I want to thank Terry for doing the work we've done moderating. And also to say this, I think knowing the fact that the costs, as we've talked about repeatedly, are really one-time costs for the most part, to the extent that there could be some groundswell support for something like this, if that support actually turned into monetary support, that could be a huge incentive for the city to get over that hump to actually make this a reality, which I think is, we all agree on, or many of us agree, is a long-term benefit for voters and
Thank you, Terry. I wanted to thank the New America Foundation Common Cause for putting on this event and for providing us with a free lunch. I also want to say a little bit about my organization, Californians for Electoral Reform. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide organization. We're the only statewide organization with a single focus of educating and advocating for instant runoff voting in accordance with proportional representations. We're all volunteer with no paid staff, and we are based upon local chapters. I'd like to introduce Jim Stauffer, who is the contact for our Santa Clara County chapter. And if anyone is interested in joining Californians for Electoral Reform, please see either Jim or myself after the meeting. Thank you.
And Blair Valtier of the New American Foundation will close.